The idea of utopia is ingrained into our modern day culture. Utopian and dystopian civilizations are common among works of fiction, movies, video games, and artwork. You should know that a fair part of the idea of utopia comes from Thomas More's book Utopia. In fact, Thomas More probably invented the word we use today, utopia. He coined the word, forming it from Greek roots. Its Grecian translation would mean something like no place, making it clear that his utopia is theoretical. However, More certainly wasn't the first author to try to describe a utopian society. A better candidate for the first full book aimed specifically at the description of a utopian society, socially, politically, and culturally, would be Plato's Republic, which was written 375 years before Christ, nearly 2,000 years before Thomas More was even born. And you could easily argue that Christ himself and the apostles of Jesus described from a religious and philosophical standpoint how to form Zion, basically utopia. Other religious leaders, including from even older religions than Christianity, have done the same thing. Utopia was published in 1516, which is still quite a long time ago. It would have been only 24 years after Christopher Columbus spotted land in the Caribbean. This book was written before Europeans had established settlements, permanent settlements, in the Americas. In fact, More was inspired by the expert navigator Amerigo Vespucci. When the book Utopia was written, it would have been especially pertinent. Europe was in a golden age of discovery, and the topic of discovering new civilizations, of the which some might possibly be superior to Europe, would have been something that was talked about. More, who has quite a sense of humor, went out of his way to write the book so that if you were particularly gullible and somewhat uneducated, you might be convinced that utopia is a real place. At the start of the book, More even provides some mock evidences and examples that come from utopia. He provides us with a cipher to help us understand the utopian alphabet. You may notice that the letters J, U, W, and Z are missing. But this is simply because those letters were probably not part of the common Latin script when More wrote the book. You'll see that, somewhat humorously, the alphabet has just been translated or copied over from English in a predictable pattern that leads us to believe the language was created the same way school children might create their own code language to write notes to one another. If you studied languages distant from English, you know that languages are not just word for word or letter for letter translations of each other. But this is part of the joke. More believed that the educated reader would see through this immediately and get a chuckle out of it, while the uneducated reader would be led to believe the evidence was genuine. In fact, there is an account of an angry fan who writes a letter critiquing More for writing his book, since, according to the fan, he doesn't deserve to gain any money for writing about a place that was discovered by someone else. This would have given More a great laugh. There is a very funny letter that Thomas More wrote to Peter Giles, included in the Penguin Classics edition that I read. In the letter, More complains about the reception of his book, and also the respect he receives as an author. He says that it's not fair that there are some people who love his book, but who don't have any respect for him as the writer of it. He compares them to rude guests who visit an event or party and eat and drink all the delicious food and fine wine, and then, when their tummies are full, promptly leave without thanking or saying anything to the host. He says that critics of his book are even worse. He compares them to bald wrestlers who grab you by the hair of your head and pull you down. And when you reach out for their hair to do the same to them, you realize they don't have any. The book Utopia reads as if you were privy to a conversation between Thomas More himself and Raphael Hythlode, or in the version I read, his name is translated as Raphael Nonsenso. The fact that it sounds like nonsense is intentional. More says that the utopian people trace themselves linguistically to Greek roots. especially in names and place names. And throughout the book, Moore uses many names he created himself from Greek origin. It should be noted that Moore was fluent in Greek, and while not writing, he worked as a translator, bringing Greek classics to a Latin audience. Raphael had lived in Utopia for more than 5 years, and is describing to Moore all of Utopia's customs and their people. I really enjoyed this book, and if you read a version that's been updated to vernacular English, you'll finish it fairly swiftly. I have to respect Moore for being very brief and open about his ideas. He doesn't take too long talking about any one thing. Utopia brings fresh insight in its comparison with Europe. Moore contrasts his supposedly superior civilization with Western civilization, and it helps you see how ridiculous many of our customs are. He shares some memorable ideas about how a utopia could or would be, and why it is that our civilization isn't a utopia. I also thought that the ending was really delightful and really quick. The book just sort of ended all of a sudden. One thing that I thought was interesting is that in Utopia, the toilets are made of gold, but not in the sense you are perhaps thinking. Their utopia is not unfathomably wealthy, and the toilets are not made of gold because they have such great riches and because they can make their amenities out of any material they want. But rather, utopians know that in the outside world, we sadly consider some precious gemstones and gold as being more important than even human life. This idea is so despondent to utopians that they make their toilets out of gold to solidify how they feel about gold, money, and riches. They deliberately do everything they can to disrespect gold, to degrade it. They do so to avoid drifting culturally in a direction where wealth becomes important. Their utopia works somewhat like a Jewish commune, where property is all shared and there is no use for money. Supposedly, there has been a sort of loving tug-of-war between Catholics and communists over this book. Both Catholics and proponents of communism claim this book suggests that the incorporation of their respective ideology is necessary for a utopian society. However, I'll leave it up to you to decide for yourself whether it is if this book is a true proponent for either of these. I personally thought that Moore's objective in Utopia is not to push for communism nor to further Catholicism, but rather was truly just Moore's personal idea of utopia. And he, as a man, as a human, just so happened to have been influenced by the Catholic Church and by learning somewhat of communist living. It's been about 3 days now since I finished this book, and I think that's a good gestation period to let the ideas settle a bit. While I was reading Utopia, I was agitated and critical of Moore for a number of things. I thought that Moore was oftentimes really boyish and lazy about the how and the why of the individuals that made up his utopia. He sometimes appeared to be really just boyish, in other words, disconnected from reality, and the fact that individuals vary greatly in viewpoint and personal desire, and that a realistic society needed to accommodate individuals. Other times I was annoyed that Moore had the habit of telling rather than showing how utopia worked. His utopia lacked depth, and he seemed to get away with claiming his utopia was perfect. It felt like a third-person viewpoint rather than a first-person viewpoint. He also rarely showed examples of what it would be like to live in utopia, explaining why people were motivated to form the utopian society in the first place, or giving deeper insight of what it truly might be like to interact there. He was shallow too often for my liking. Also, you should be alerted that Moore's utopia is very patriarchal and definitely doesn't jive with our modern viewpoint of women, feminism, and the female gender being equally deserving of respect, power, and opportunities. But now that it's even just been a couple of days, I'm not as annoyed about any of that anymore. I think the ideas of utopia are worth exploring, even if you have to wade through murky waters. If you're interested in this book, I'd recommend you check it out from your local library, or you can purchase it online. But yeah, I highly recommend it. I really enjoyed this read. Like I said, it's really a small book. You get through it very quickly. It's only 120 pages, 100 and so pages, and you can buy it in Old English, or you can buy it in the vernacular. I prefer the vernacular, just the Penguin Classics edition. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, guys.